Hey everyone, I'm Annie Rind, and you're listening to the 1001 Business Problems Solved with Microsoft Teams podcast. Before we get into business today, I want to start with something a little different for Memorial Day. And because it's Memorial Day weekend, we wanted to get this out there before the holiday itself. That's why this is an unusual Saturday drop. This week, I was walking around our town square and something caught my attention. Our town had installed banners on the light poles, portraits of veterans who had died in service, and there were dozens of them, each with a face, a name, and a uniform. And as I walked around the square, I found myself slowing down, almost without meaning to, and really looking into their eyes. Not just glancing, actually looking. And I realized something that hit me harder than I expected. These men grew up in this town. When those portraits were taken, none of them knew they weren't coming back. They're young in those photos, and you can see a kind of confidence there, sometimes even a quiet optimism, and in every case you're looking at a moment in time where life was still ahead of them, not behind them. And as I stood there and moved from one banner to the next, something shifted in me. I've experienced a lot of Memorial Days over the years, and like most people, I've always carried a general sense of appreciation, a respect for the idea of sacrifice and what it represents. But this time was different because I wasn't thinking about veterans in general anymore. I was thinking about this local person, and then this one, and then the next, and I found myself imagining what their lives might have been like, and then, almost without trying, thinking about how those lives ended, not in some distant, abstract way, but in a very real and human way that's hard to put into words. And then my mind went to their local families, their parents, their brothers and sisters, the people who got that knock at the door and had to somehow find a way to live with that kind of loss. And as I kept walking, moving from one face to the next, I felt something that I don't think I had ever really felt on prior Memorial Days. Not just appreciation, but a very focused, almost weighty sense of gratitude. It wasn't an idea anymore. It was specific, and because it was specific, it stayed with me. It followed me from one banner to the next instead of fading into the background. And to be honest with you, I almost hate to pivot away from that, because that experience really deserves to just sit on its own for a while. But I also know why you're here, and I know this podcast is about helping you move your business forward, so I want to draw a parallel that I think is worth considering. Because I see something very similar play out in businesses every single day. Most leaders are walking around with what I would describe as a kind of vague optimism when it comes to technology. They know they should be doing something with AI, or they feel like they should be getting more out of Teams, or they've heard about SharePoint or Power BI or automation, and there's just this general sense that there's something here we should be taking advantage of. And that instinct isn't wrong at all. In fact, it's usually a sign that you're paying attention and thinking ahead. But when that optimism stays general, when it never gets anchored to anything specific, it tends to lead in one of two directions. Either it turns into a kind of constant, low-level thinking loop where you're reading, researching, having conversations, maybe even getting excited about possibilities, but never quite taking that first concrete step. Or it turns into activity that looks like progress on the surface, like rolling out a tool or trying something new, but doesn't actually resolve anything underneath because the real friction in the business was never clearly identified to begin with. So you end up with motion, but not traction. And this is where that experience in the town square comes back in, because the moment things changed for me was the moment I moved away from general appreciation and started looking at individual people. The specificity changed everything. And the same thing is true in your business. When you move away from thinking about tools in general and instead focus your attention on one specific point of friction, one place where work feels heavier than it should, or where people keep asking the same questions, or where things slow down because no one quite knows where to go or what the current state of things is, you begin to see clearly in a way that simply isn't possible when everything stays at that higher level. And once you can see clearly, the next step usually isn't complicated. You're not trying to implement AI anymore. You're trying to remove a very specific obstacle. You're not trying to roll out teams, you're trying to give one piece of work a predictable home so people don't have to keep reconstructing it. You're not trying to improve everything at once. You're improving something real that people can actually feel. And that's where traction starts. So, as we wrap up today, I want to bring this all the way back to where we started. Memorial Day, at its core, is about remembering, but what I was reminded of this weekend is that remembrance becomes much more real when it shifts from something general to something specific. When it's connected to a face or a name or a life, it stops being an idea and becomes something you can actually feel. And in your business, progress works the very same way. It becomes real when it becomes specific. So today, I would encourage you to carry both of those with you. At some point in the day, take a moment to remember in a way that's focused rather than general, even if it's just pausing long enough to really think about one person and what their sacrifice meant. And then, when you turn back to your work, resist the pull toward vague optimism. Instead, pick one point of friction, look at it closely, understand it clearly, and take a step toward making it better. Because in both cases, it all begins when you move away from the general and start paying attention to something specific. This is Annie signing off.